The vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean is a perilous, unknown sheet of water that serves to intimidate and inspire hope. War has been waged throughout these seas, lives lost, and empires toppled. Despite this, it has also been the home to numerous breakthroughs and advancements throughout human history. One of these such times is the formation of the Atlantic Charter between American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commonly known as FDR, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Atlantic Charter was the joint declaration of purpose for the world issued by FDR and Winston Churchill at the Atlantic Conference held at Placentia Bay, Newfoundland on August 9-12, 1941. At this point, World War II had been raging on in Europe for nearly 2 years. Before this meeting, America had been supporting the Allies with money and other resources, yet they had not officially entered the war. After World War I, America had favored a policy of isolationism and neutrality that allowed them to stay out of World War II longer than most countries. However, the U.S. would ultimately be provoked into joining the Allies mere months after the creation of the Atlantic Charter due to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Solidifying the connection between the United States and Great Britain, the Atlantic Charter helped create a common post-war goal between the nations, create a sturdy foundation for numerous nations to engage in foreign relations, known as the United Nations, and sparked internal debates on the front of engaging in European warfare.
The Atlantic Charter solidified the alliance between Great Britain and the United States, sparking debate on the stance taken by America in World War II. Many debated the dangers of entering this war. A multitude of civilians believed that in creating the Atlantic Charter, the United States was establishing a passive-aggressive attitude towards the Axis powers in World War II. The profound and far-reaching importance of this document was apparent. The fact alone of the United States making such a declaration was astonishing. The inclusion in it of a reference to the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny implied a warlike action. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, agreed with the American population that publishing this document was essentially endorsing the idea of the United States' involvement in the war. It was indubitably a risky stance to take. Winston Churchill was not alone in this opinion, as a large portion of the American population expressed their anger towards the situation. The Atlantic Charter is only another symptom of democratic inadequacy. It only matters for that reason. It will be not the Charter of Peace, for peace terms will not be made by two men. However, well-intentioned and noble, meeting on a boat somewhere and issuing what has all earmarks of an improvised statement. The mental and physical anguish of the last years will not be cured by 8 pills. United States civilians felt very discomforted at these brutal times of war, and the Atlantic Charter did not help with this in the slightest. By solidifying the connection with Great Britain, the United States were establishing themselves as enemies with the Nazi tyranny, only furthering the discomfort in American citizens. Newspapers all across America were furious and ashamed of their government for being so foolish. But point 8 of the Atlantic Charter means that no peace can be negotiated with any German government that would have the support of the German people or the German army. It commits Britain and the United States in an attempt to defeat the German armies and the German people and impose dictated peace. And it's a very great question whether this is possible, and an even greater question whether it is desirable. Internal debates reflected upon what civilians believed were Atlantic Charter's soon-to-come implications. America wasn't the only country where debates were being held over this revolutionary document. Countries all over Africa analyzed the Atlantic Charter and aspired for Great Britain to hold themselves true to their words. African intellectuals widely quoted the third article, for it raised hopes for a drastically changed post-war political landscape, one in which Africans would exercise greater autonomy and work toward independence. African scholars seized this opportunity to gain support and make names for themselves, while other Africans saw through the lies and knew that these goals did not apply to them. The stance on World War II by the United States that was intended to be neutral, but the Atlantic Charter altered how the world would view the United States, not as a neutral power, but as an ally to Great Britain in World War II.
Along with creating a bond between the U.S. and Great Britain, the Atlantic Charter also allowed countries to work together that otherwise wouldn't have. These countries worked together to form the United Nations, a collective of countries that resolve to restore world peace and avoid world war and the destruction that comes along with it. Much of the guidelines and principles of the United Nations are directly derived from the original Atlantic Charter document. Primarily, both these documents emphasize the importance of equality and the freedom for all countries to operate independently and create their own legacy. While it certainly promoted freedom and equality, it also supported the United States' secondary goal of stopping the spread of communism. Within the Atlantic Charter, it reads, Third, they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Clearly, the guidelines of the Atlantic Charter promote freedom of government and a country's ability to choose their own form of government. Similarly, the United Nations official document carries the same value, reading, "The United Nations shall place no restrictions on the eligibility of men and women to participate in any capacity and under conditions of equality in its principles and subsidiary organs." This specific statute is perhaps the one that most benefits smaller countries that are still trying to establish themselves, because it grants them freedom to explore their boundaries while also having the support of major superpowers such as the United States and Great Britain. As countries help each other to develop, it forms connections between them and can help foster peace for the future. The Atlantic Charter also promotes peace within neutral spaces all around the world. For example, the seventh guideline of the Atlantic Charter states that the seas are part of the world to be used by all countries free of contention or fighting. It reads, "Seventh, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance." This section of the Atlantic Charter promotes freedom of the seas and the ability for every country to compromise and share the oceans of the world. The economic and social benefits that come from the sharing of the seas makes it beneficial for the whole world to work together. The idea of peace, which is the main idea for both of these documents, is prominent in both of these quotes. It is on the matter of peace which is why the Atlantic Charter was formed in the first place, and it is the same peace that was used to inspire the United Nations. These documents help to understand the necessity for peace at the time, as there is a theme throughout every guideline of each document. In a newspaper published in Ohio on February 2, 1945, there is an article that details how many Americans are in favor of the United Nations utilizing the Atlantic Charter in order to create their own governing document. The section reads, "We are told by Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain in his characteristically outspoken fashion that while the leaders of the United Nations are still aiming at the principles of the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations clearly took inspiration from the Atlantic Charter, and Churchill even says this and continues to preach this throughout the whole process of the creation of the United Nations. Both of these documents bear resemblance to each other, and the United Nations derived many of its principles from those of the Atlantic Charter, and they both serve to benefit the countries affected by World War II and to prevent any future conflict of that nature."
The Atlantic Charter, a document consisting of 8 individual statements that established the two nations' joint focuses, created common post-war goals for the United States and Great Britain. The 8th point reads, "They believe that all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. They believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential." After experiencing over 40 million casualties during World War I, both the U.S. and the British placed value on demilitarizing the world after World War II and getting rid of weapons of mass destruction, striving for peace. World War I had an enormous effect on the world's leading nations. It was a money vacuum that put all of the world powers in shambles. World War I had an inconceivable 40 million casualties, consisting of 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. With that being said, they all thought that after World War I, countries would not want to go back to war because of how destructive it proved to be. And upon the start of World War II, Great Britain and the U.S. realized that proactively planning against further war was rather a necessity. The 5th point reads, "Fifth, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancements, and social security." In the 2 decades after World War I, the U.S. experienced the tense Roaring '20s, along with the bleak Great Depression that destroyed the American economy. The U.S. desperately wanted to avoid the plausibility of a similar situation occurring after the end of World War II, and so they made a point to make a plan for the world economy after World War II. The creation of a more stable and prosperous world economy would help the U.S. to avoid another economical disaster similar to the Great Depression. Learning from past events and wanting to create a more peaceful world with more inclusivity. The Atlantic Charter focused heavily on what would happen at the end of World War II.
The Atlantic Charter exists as perhaps one of the most important documents during the World War II period, as it had serious implications for the war and the time after it. First, it signified the connection between the U.S. and Great Britain and confirmed the notion that the U.S. would join the Allied powers when it inevitably joined the World War II. It also provided support for other smaller countries that were struggling and vulnerable at the time. Unifying the U.S. and Great Britain led to other countries joining the Allied forces and eventually gave them enough power to defeat the Axis powers. also provided necessary guidance for the world post-World War II, creating structure and reliability to countries and regions that would otherwise be in chaos at the time. While it was an incredibly important document at the time, some of the things that it strived to resolve during the time are still issues in today's world. For example, one of the main points of the document was to promote peace within the international community, yet today there are still wars and conflicts that take lives and cripple the economies of certain regions. Despite this, the Charter was overall an incredibly effective document that allowed the U.S. and Great Britain to unify in a time of chaos.